Good evening. It's wonderful to have Robert Colescott's extended family here. It's a very, very special night. So welcome. I'm Brian Fariso, director of the Portland Art Museum, and we're just thrilled to have you here tonight. And as I mentioned before at a press preview, this exhibition for us is very, very meaningful because Robert Colescott is intertwined within our community for a number of reasons. He was a professor, as many of you may know, at Portland State University. But I think most significantly, and we're just thrilled that Life Trustee Arlene Schnitzer is here tonight. Arlene and for those of you who don't know Arlene, she's got a remarkable sense of talent, and she really understood, I think, Robert Colescott before many of where we are today, many art historians. She saw his talent, she collected him, made his work available through the Fountain Gallery, and I think became very close friends. And when I arrived here in 2006, I had known of Robert Colescott's work, and how significant it was to art history and to the canon and to understand it, but I never knew the depth and the genesis of how he became Robert Colescott, and I think a lot of it's due to Arlene and this community. So a big thanks to Arlene and her support, and I think the other important aspect, and you'll see this work in the exhibition, is Robert Colescott's collaboration with Carrie Mae Weems. And as many of you may recall, we did a major retrospective exhibition of Carrie's work here several years ago. Carrie is from Portland as well, grew up here, and seeing that collaboration come together is quite special, and having that work in the exhibition. And finally, I would say that for those of you who have studied art history, Robert Colescott takes art history, makes us think deeply about it, makes us problematize art history, and then tosses it around and beats us around the head a little bit. So Lowery's going to speak more about that. She's got better words than I do about how Robert Colescott hits us upside the head. But that's also, I think, important for me to have Lowery Stokes Sims here with us. For those of you who don't know our guest curator, and you'll hear from her, and Grace is going to formally introduce her, she is really someone who is renowned in the field and has been a great leader for many of us in the field of art museums. She led the way on a number of important issues through her leadership at the Metropolitan, the Studio Museum, and the Museum of Art and Design, and it's just a real thrill for me to be partnering with her as well as Matthew on this project. So Lowery, thank you, and Matthew, thank you so much for coming. I'm going to be introducing Grace Kook-Anderson, our curator of this exhibition and coordinating on-staff person. But before I do, I'd like to recognize and honor the indigenous peoples of this region on whose ancestral lands this museum now stands. These include the Willamette Tumwater, Clackamas, Cathlamet, Molalla, Multnomah, Watlala, Chinook peoples, and the Tualatin Kalapua, who today are part of the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde. There are many other Native communities who made their homes here along the Columbia River. We also want to recognize that Portland today is a community of many diverse communities and many diverse Native peoples who continue to live and work here. We respectfully acknowledge and honor all Indigenous communities, past, present, and future, and are grateful for their ongoing and vibrant presence. I would also like to take a moment to share a few accessibility announcements about tonight's program. T-coil, headset, and earbud-compatible assisted listening devices are available. We're using an automated captioning program to provide real-time captioning. These captions can be viewed on stage or by opening your phone URL at pam.to/ captions on your mobile web browser. The PAM public Wi-Fi network is also available. If it slows, please refresh it, and please see a staff member if you have any questions. We'd also like to thank and acknowledge our American Sign Language English interpreters. As you can see on stage, Amanda Hayes, L'Oreal Aviles, and Tara Trope. For communication to work effectively, we ask that during the question and answer portion at the end of our program, that one person speak at a time, and that you wait for a microphone to be passed to you. If you have any access needs that are not being met, please let museum staff know as soon as possible. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce Grace Kook-Anderson, the Arlene and Harold Schnitzer Curator of Northwest Art. Prior to joining the museum in 2017, Grace was an adjunct assistant professor in the School of Art and Design at Portland State University, and she worked as an independent curator and arts writer. From 2008 to 2015, she was the curator of contemporary art at the Laguna Art Museum. Grace received a dual BA degree in art history and art practice from the University of California, Berkeley, and received her MA degree in curatorial practice from the California College of the Arts in San Francisco. Grace will do the honors of introducing tonight's program and our guest, Lowery Stokes Sims and Matthew Weseley. Grace.
Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Great, great. Well, thank you all so much for being here. This is truly special. It feels like a reunion on a number of levels, so it feels so good right now. Thank you so much. So I'll say really quickly, Portland Art Museum, we're really pleased to present Art and Race Matters, the Career of Robert Colescott. The first comprehensive retrospective of Robert Colescott is organized by the Contemporary Art Center in Cincinnati. Through vibrant paintings and biting satire, Colescott's work is very much engaged with many of our issues right now around race, gender, and identity. So we'd like to thank our generous sponsors who helped make this exhibition program possible. Presenting sponsor, the Harold and Arlene Schnitzer Care Foundation, the Ed Cordero Fund of the Oregon Community Foundation, the William G. Gilmore Foundation, Nancy S. McGraw, the James F. and Marion L. Miller Foundation, and the Portland Art Museum's exhibition series sponsors. So I'm very pleased to introduce our co-curators this evening, Lowery Stokes Sims and Matthew Weseley. So Lowery Stokes Sims is an independent art historian and curator who was a close associate of Colescott and wrote about and exhibited his work for over 40 years. She retired as curator emerita from the Museum of Arts and Design in New York, where she served as the Charles Bronfman International Curator and the William and Mildred Ladson Chief Curator from 2007 to 2015. Prior to her tenure at the Museum of Arts and Design, Sims served as executive director, president, and adjunct curator for the permanent collection at the Studio Museum in Harlem from 2000 to 2007. Previously, she served on the education and curatorial staff of the Metropolitan Museum of Art from 1972 to 1999, where she curated over 30 exhibitions. Matthew Weseley is an independent art historian. He earned a bachelor's degree in art history from Stanford University. We're still duking that out. A master's degree in education from Smith College, and a master's degree in art history from the University of California, Davis. He's currently working on an academic monograph on the work of Robert Colescott. It is an honor to have you both here. Thank you so much.
Great to be here.
Thank you. So my hope is that we'll wrap up at around 7:30, and for those of you who haven't yet seen the exhibition, you'll have a little bit of time to get a sneak peek this evening. We'll try to make that happen. So in this conversation, We're hoping to discuss some deeper insights into Colescott's life and the influence of his work, to discuss some of the more complicated subjects of race and beauty in his work, in relation to Colescott's own self-identifications, to take a moment to really see and unpack a couple of paintings in depth, the fun art history part that I hope we can do. And for all of us here sharing this space together this evening, I'd like to add that thanks to Robert Colescott, we have a lot of challenging materials to discuss, to be confronted with, to navigate to the best of our abilities. I'm thankful to the Portland Art Museum, to our director, Brian Fariso, and to all my colleagues as we've been working really hard on being vulnerable together as an institution to address issues around race, equity, and inclusion. It is messy, it is hard, and it is necessary. So with this in mind, I'd like to call out and share with you some of our agreement commitments that we share at the museum to help us move these conversations forward more thoughtfully. Stay engaged. Speak your truth responsibly. Listen to understand. Be willing to do things differently. Experience discomfort. Expect and accept non-closure. That's a big one with Robert Colescott, I think. So I wanted to begin by asking you, Lowery and Matthew, about your relationship to Colescott, your history, and how that has impacted the development, the creation of this retrospective.
Well, I first saw Bob's work in the late 70s, and I was a sort of young curator at the Metropolitan Museum. At the time, I didn't realize how momentous my position was, because until last year, believe it or not, I was the first and only Black person to be a curator at the Metropolitan Museum. So I was working for Henry Gelzella, who was a legendary curator of 20th century art. And Henry and I had a sort of offhand relationship. And one day he said, "I'm going to take you down to see art," which he never did. So he took me down to Semaphore Gallery to sort of see a show of this artist named Robert Colescott. And I walked in and I went, oh my God. You know, I was born 49, lived through the 60s, was trying to navigate feminism, Black power, my mother's bourgeois pretensions, and Colescott told me I could sort of like play a game and pretend I was, but be transgressive all the time. Mm-hmm. So I just fell in love and I was hooked. And I, through Semaphore, got in touch with him and we started seeing each other. My brother lived in San Francisco, so we would have dinner. And then when he came to New York, we saw each other all the time. And we fought constantly. He was about 24, 25 years older than me, so we had generational issues. And but I just, you know, have remained convinced of his work, mainly because it challenges me every day.
Great, thank you. How about you, Matthew?
Well, I first saw Colescott's work in 1996. I was living in Birmingham, Michigan, and several years earlier I had seen the work of Joan Brown and Roy DeForest, who were friends and colleagues of Colescott's in the Bay Area in the 1970s. And you know, with all three of them, I felt that I was in the presence of the work of a great artist, and that was it. And it started a journey for me. And I will say, those of you who didn't hear it before, I really started researching Colescott in earnest when I was living here in Portland in 2009, 2010. And I spent a lot of time in the Crumpacker Library, and Deborah Royer was a big help to me. So. So it's been not as long as Lowery, but a long time.
Great. I love how the exhibition begins with this pivotal painting, 1919, and it stems the portraits. It begins with this. And in the publication, a beautiful publication recognized by the New York Times for being last year's, what is it, best art book?
One of them.
One of them, best art books. high up there, though. But in your essay, Matthew, I think what was wonderful is that a lot of biography is noted, and the early history and the complication of race. But maybe you can talk a bit about that aspect of it as we also go into the painting.
Okay, so we're going to talk about 1919, which is the first painting that you see when you go into the show. But I thought we should look at this photograph here. These are Robert's parents, his father, Warrington Wickham Colescott Sr., and Lydia Kenner Hutton. They were about in their late 20s when this picture was taken. Warrington was born in December of 1890 in New Orleans, Louisiana. Lydia was born in June of 1891 in Jackson Hines, Mississippi. They had a complex ancestry. Lydia had ancestors, some of whom were white, some of whom were black, some of whom were Jewish. Warrington had some ancestors who were white, some who were black, and some who were Native American. Living in New Orleans meant living in a segregated situation. They attended schools for black or colored, that was a word they used at the time, black or colored children. Before World War I, Warrington Sr., who was a classically trained violinist, played for some pretty prominent ensembles in New Orleans, including Louis Armstrong and Kid Ory. This photograph is courtesy Lauren McIntosh Walrod, who's here. It's amazing to me that both Lauren and Robert's son, Alex, knew Robert's parents, which is just amazing to me. There is documentation that Warrington Sr. moved to the California Bay Area before World War I. He got a job, probably through Lauren's great-grandfather, working as a waiter on the Southern Pacific Railroad before World War I. He was drafted for World War I in 1917. He served in the 92nd Division. The 92nd Division was one of two combat divisions of black or colored soldiers during World War I. The majority of divisions in World War I that were black or colored soldiers were what they called labor divisions. They either dug trenches or unloaded ships or did other menial tasks. There were only two combat divisions. Warrington Sr. was in one of them. So Warrington was drafted. He went to France. He fought on the front line, and he returned. And I suspect that he must have known Lydia before the war, because as soon as he got back, here they are, and they got married. And as soon as they got married, they left for the Bay Area. And Robert commemorated this journey in this painting that he painted in 1980. I believe the painting has never before been displayed. I'm not certain about that, but I never came across any record of it being shown. We got it from Robert's estate through Blum and Poe. They had it. When Robert moved from the Bay Area to Tucson in the mid-'80s, the paintings all got rolled up and went into storage. So this painting tells us a lot about Robert's parents and Robert's own relationship with them. He has depicted his father in his military uniform. The military uniform has a buffalo on the insignia. The buffalo was the symbol of the 92nd Division. The buffalo refers to buffalo soldiers, who were black soldiers who fought in the West after the Civil War. His father has a couple of attributes, a bottle of liquor, cigarettes, a musical note referring to his career as a musician. His mother has a number of attributes there, a slice of apple pie, a pen, a book of poetry, some roses, a musical note because she was a very talented pianist. You can see next to New Orleans, there's a red arrow pointing west, and then there's a line going into the Bay Area. This is indicating their move. The birds in the nest, in the tree, symbolize the family. It's Robert's parents and his older brother, Warrington Jr., who was born 4 years before him. One of the things that struck me about the painting immediately was that Robert has painted his father's skin so much darker than his mother's skin. And I think you saw from the picture that their complexions were not really that different. Colescott said in an interview in the Oregonian in 1969, he said, "Color is only valid if it has to do with the idea." And I think he had started using color symbolically in the late 50s, and he did it until the 90s. So for him, his use of color communicates the content of the painting. I can't go into it in a great deal of depth, but the painting introduces two themes that are, I think, important to Colescott. First, this whole idea of traveling to the Bay Area from New Orleans. Robert described that as part of the Great Migration of black people out of the South. The whole purpose was to search for better opportunities. The whole notion of assimilating, integrating into the mainstream of American society, that was a top priority for Colescott's parents. It was a top priority for Colescott and his brother. Colescott's parents wanted him to be a lawyer and his brother to be a doctor. They both became artists, but they both had tremendous drive and ambition as well as talent. That's part of what the painting is about. The painting also introduces a kind of racial conflict in the family. It seems as if Colescott's parents had different notions of their own racial identities. It's complicated. I don't think I can really explain it to you fully now, but in Arlene's wonderful interview in the catalog, Colescott told her that it was his mother who told him that he had to pass for white in order to become anything in this world. And both Robert and Warrington Jr., when they were in the military, they were in regular divisions. They were not in segregated divisions, and the Army was still segregated during World War II when Robert and his older brother served. My sense of the different use of color in this painting is that Robert is telling us that his father embraced more strongly his black identity than his mother did. That his mother might not have wanted to, might have wanted to avoid identifying as black. I will say, it is wonderful being here and talking to you. I am a researcher. And one of the things I love about researchers, you do it by yourself. I'm not used to talking to a group of people like you. Lowery is, I'm not. And it's tremendously exciting and interesting to be here with you all because there's so many friends and family and people who knew Colescott, which also makes it a little intimidating. But as a researcher, I'm a fiend for documents. And when Lowery and I came here in 2017 to do research, Lori LeBath, Arlene's assistant, when we walked into the office, Lori said, "Well, would you like to see Arlene's archive?" And of course, yes, I spent hours going through that archive in Lowery too. And I found a document in there which I thought I would share with you. It's heartbreaking, very personal. It's unclear exactly why Robert wrote this down, but it's on Fountain Gallery stationery. It's apparently from the late 1980s. And this is what he wrote. "Mixed messages from my mother. Only way out of this dilemma was to be white. She saw my brother as Messiah. Keep me quiet, obscure. I wouldn't screw it up for him." And that, we had heard that story from other people, but to find that document to me was remarkable. In any case, I think this is an appropriate painting to begin the show because it really introduces these two major themes for Colescott: this notion of assimilating into the mainstream of American society, integrating, and also the racial conflict that he and his brother inherited from their parents. Lauren McIntosh Wildrod, who supplied us with the photograph in her memoir in the catalog, she describes this situation in greater detail. So that would be a good place to look if you want to learn more.
Mm-hmm. Larry, do you want to add anything to this?
Oh, it's such a common story that, my stepmother told me. She was from Trinidad, and her father was Chinese, and her mother was sort of a mixed race. And her mother was able, they lived in Harlem, but her mother was able to pass and could then go downtown and work in the garment district in New York City. So it's a story. It's kind of tragic. It breaks up families. There's a great bio of Elsie DaCosta Green, who was the curator of J.P. Morgan, and her family came from a group of very light-skinned people in Washington, D.C. Her father, Richard Green, was very distinguished. I think he was one of the first African Americans to graduate from Yale, but he was a little too dark. And when they moved from Washington to New York, the mother and the kids separated from him, and even though he went on to great things. And she herself added de Coster in her name to sort of suggest she was Portuguese, you know, some kind of like Southern European, you know. And in those days, you know, Italians, Southern Europeans, Spaniards were looked at as slightly different. And she was able to sort of have this illustrious career. But it's interesting that according to her biography, her peers, her siblings got married, but they never had kids. Because you know that little drop of black will show up when you don't want to know it. That's it. So it's a very common story.
Right. It's a heartbreaking story.
So I think it's interesting that it took Robert to when he went to Egypt to sort of really get there.
Yeah. I want to talk briefly just about the kind of breeze through the early works. So he graduated from high school in 1943. He enlisted in the Army. He served in Europe. In 1946, he enrolled in San Francisco State University and then went to Berkeley. In 1949, he went to France on a GI Bill and studied with the modernist Fernand Léger. And can you talk about some of these early paintings? And then in the next slide, I'll show some images of paintings that he did when he was up in the Northwest, sort of the beginning introductions to the Northwest.
Okay, so these are two paintings that are in the estate, so these remained in Robert's possession his whole life. The one on the relationship is obviously, it was done while he was Léger's student. There's an earlier painting which is in the show, which belongs to Lauren, which is a geometric abstraction. I think both of them show him kind of imitating older artists, really taking on their artistic identities. Léger had a teaching studio, and Colescott was one of a number of Americans who went over there. Colescott was much more positive about Léger as a teacher than some of the other Americans, and that's something I kind of wonder about. The painting is very much like Léger. Léger had a very mechanistic conception of the figure. These figures in this painting, they're not like flesh and blood human beings to me. They look like sort of machines in human form. You have the non-naturalistic colors, the abrupt contrasts. So there are a lot of, Colescott, interestingly, he gave a lecture at Harvard in 1997. He said, the trick when working with Léger is not to fall in the trap of imitating him, but I think Colescott kind of fell into the trap. The other important thing that I really need to mention is when Colescott came to the studio of Léger, he showed Léger these abstractions that he had been doing in the style of the first painting in the show, which is kind of geometric abstraction, and Léger refused to look at them. And Colescott told this story many times. And Léger said to him, "I'm sorry, I used to paint abstractly myself, but I've rejected that kind of work because that kind of work does not communicate ideas to people." And so Colescott held on to that. That was, Léger remained an important role model, and that's one of the reasons why. It was because of the rejection of abstraction and avant-garde art. The other painting is from Seattle, OCSC. It's a very, very interesting painting. When Colescott arrived in Seattle, he came under the influence of William Ivey, who was an abstract expressionist painter who had been a student and protege of Clifford Still at the California School of Fine Arts. If you go into the 20th century galleries right now, there's a 1960 painting by Colescott, and hanging right nearby is a painting by William Ivey. So it's interesting to compare them. Ivey used to say that the purpose of art is expression, and the task of the artist is to find the appropriate means or language for that expression. And I think that's relevant to Colescott. Ivey also painted with this loose and broken brushstroke, and I think Colescott has kind of picked up on that. When Colescott came to Seattle in the mid-90s, he said William Ivey was one of the people who influenced him the most. Ivey had died by then. That's probably enough on those paintings.
But I think it's interesting too, going over to the next slide, when he is in Portland now, and he, I think you had pointed out how he's really kind of doing the genres, the landscapes, the still lifes, and the friendships he falls into here in Portland that also, I think, influences the way he works. You really get a sense he's just trying out a lot of different things, right? And then here we are, he gets a residency in Egypt. Lowery, can you tell us about kind of this moment? And one of the things that I think is so interesting is that it feels like such a mythology in some ways, this kind of Colescott's narrative of this sort of finding himself and this sort of becoming. There is, it feels so mythological in some ways, but I would love to hear sort of anecdotes of his experiences around that and how he talks about that.
Well, there's several things. There's a famous quote for him about these paintings that he did them because he was haunted by the queens, these valley queens in Egypt.
Yes, yeah.
And it wasn't until I went to Egypt in 2011 that I really kind of understood what he was talking to. And I think particularly being at the tomb of Hatshepsut, I sat there and I looked at the sort of processions they had of all these different cultures and races that were coming and paying tribute, to Hatshepsut, that I sort of really got into Bob's thing, and then went to the Valley of the Kings going down and seeing the bright colors, that are still so vivid today, because there's such a contrast between what he was doing up in Portland, with the weather. And it's interesting how a site can do things. And he talked about the fact that he couldn't buy paints, so he had to sort of use initially some paints that he could buy, in the marketplace, and sort of grind them and sort of put them together. But I think the interesting thing is that I've been asked quite a few times if he knew Bob Thompson, who was another African-American artist working at about the same time. And I'm sort of trying now to sort of work on a essay about it. But Bob Thompson did a similar kind of use of color in a very symbolic, imaginative way. But he did, as Bob did, he used a lot of existing art history as a kind of reference and sort of switched them around to sort of make kind of statements about these sort of classless, raceless, situations, and that which broadened things out. For me, what's fascinating in these paintings is how you begin to sort of get a lot of the sort of approaches to composition that Bob picks up on later. This kind of sense of these color shapes that sort of fit together. There's in a kind of non-Renaissance perspectival space. They're almost like puzzle pieces that come together. One thinks of Hans Hofmann, or I'm sure that Bob did not know Hans Hofmann, with this idea of push and pull. Sort of using different hues to sort of create space rather than having this kind of diminishing back into space. The way that he's sort of created the figures sort of flying and moving, into space, sort of very much an integral part of the entire composition, I think is a great, as you see in the Dr. Ehrlich's Magic Bullet on the to your left.
Yes.
Those are really important lessons for how we should look at his latest work, when he gets into the 80s and 90s, because there's, he breaks up perspective and he sort of creates little pockets of space, and each figure seems to have their own sort of, positioning, but they all somehow relate to each other in a very interesting way. So I think that these are very exciting. I think in the Nubian Queen, in particular, you sort of get the idea that you could have a pink sky or a red sky, and you could have sort of this passage. He seemed to like this idea of passage, using rivers as a kind of passage in his paintings. So these paintings sort of really set up who Bob will be in about 10 years, if not more. And I think that, one of the sort of last kind of scholarly things that we have to do is to sort of be able to put a series of images of all these kind of Valley Queen Egyptian paintings together with some work that we know might exist from 69 to 70 to sort of see how these begin to coalesce into the poster style that he begins. But these paintings, looking at them, again, really set up what he does. And it's interesting because a lot of times artists do that. I mean, he wasn't a student, but I can't tell you the number of times I've seen an artist-student work, and then they go off and wander and do something else. And then for their mature work, they come right back to where they were as students. And this is what I think these paintings are for Bob.
Yeah. I mean, that's the wonderful thing with this retrospective is you see him revisiting a lot of those ideas and those conversations that do keep coming back. His time abroad is, to me, really interesting because he loved his time in Cairo so much, he goes back, right? He goes back, and then he spends a bit of time in Rome and Paris. He returns with his family to the US in 1969. And that gap during that period is fascinating to me because in many ways he missed out on the civil rights movement, he missed out on the anti-Vietnam War movement. And I wonder how much he was sort of immersed in the news in the US, immersed in kind of what was happening. In some ways, I felt like in the 70s, he comes in with a vengeance of these subjects.
But when he was in Cairo, he was like into the Egypt-Israeli conflict because he had to leave Cairo with the 7 Days War. So he was in a different kind of conflict, that was happening at the time. There was like so much, going on at that time. Also, Bob would have been a little bit older than the students who were sort of leading really the revolutions that have come. He probably would have been a professor who was barricaded in his office as the students had a strike or something like that. So I think that's, something interesting to do. But that is a really good point that, when he comes to the States, and he starts making, paintings like George Washington Carver and Liberty Leading the People, that he's really sort of picking up on some of the main themes that are sort of really talked about in the sort of civil rights and movements and things like that.
Right. Matthew, do you want to add anything to that?
Well, yeah, it was amazing. I was talking to Dennett. Dennett remembers going from Egypt to Italy. Incredible. He was asked about it by Holland Cotter in 1997. He said, when I returned, I could see the change. I was overwhelmed. My experience had been that you came back from Europe and the only black people you would see in airports were people pushing a broom. Now they were demanding more, and that affected my painting. I felt like I had a lot of things to say. So.
Yeah. And thinking about that kind of moment of coming back, this painting is really growing on me. And it's the kind of poster style, the pinup girl imagery, and in some ways it feels almost like a disconnect between the army figure in the foreground, the apple pie. They seem sort of disjointed, but then. Matthew, the lecture you shared with me that Colescott gave at the museum in 1980, this is what he has to say about this painting. It has a real strong poster effect, very bold patterns. I used these again, this stereotypical female, this blonde bombshell female, who to me represents the kind of promise, that societal reward. She's the reward that you get every time you use the right deodorant, or fight the right war, or whatever. And so I try to say some things about that, and about, I had some thoughts about racial balance in Vietnam among the soldiers. So I was dealing with these things, and yet trying to hang onto the good, strong visual image at the same time. And people sometimes ask me what kind of pie that is, and it's French apple.
Well, to me, you can't look at this painting without thinking of the Don McLean song.
Yes.
Which one? I mean,
Right,
it's
right.
almost like a kind of illustration,
Right,
for it to
illustration.
a certain extent.
Yeah.
And I think that there are other ones, like there's one painting called The Winning Combination that we thought about putting in the show, and it's a woman in a marionette marching band, majorette costume, except she doesn't have her pants on. And she's waving this huge big flag. And I just thought it was just, oh God, he's being so naughty. And at one point, I was doing some research up at the Clark Institute, and I got onto Maria Elena Buzak's book on pinups. And I said, oh, yeah, he's of that generation, the pinups. So I'm flipping through on the internet, looking at sort of made a list of all the big famous 1940s pinup artists. And there's this guy, Rolf Armstrong. I'm flipping through Rolf Armstrong, and I see this paint, and I just stopped in my track. It was like an orgasmic art historian moment. There was this picture by Rolf Armstrong of a drum majorette with a big flag. She had her pants on. And the big American flag had the flags of the Allies on the end, and he had to have seen it because it was done in 1942 to raise money for the war.
Right.
So when you're looking at these, there's much of it that is kind of like Bob's memory, I think, of all the pinups, from World War II, Betty Grable, just, to do it. So it's a very kind of normal way that he does it. The whole idea of the black soldier, firing away. He often uses this, a shot in the dark, another people he does. He often uses the whole thing of the discharge of the weapon to sort of talk about dysfunctional sexual behavior. So, Bob, you have to sort of like get into, like so many, things, like when in the gallery, everybody will see a visit from Uncle Charlie. So it's Uncle Charlie's coming, and he's literally the black sheep of the family. So what does Bob have? He has a skeleton coming out of the closet and a cat coming out of a bag. So it's like, okay, we got it. The skeleton in the closet, the cat's out of the bag. Okay, thanks, Bob. So the more that you look at the pictures, you realize there's this kind of like cornball way that he sort of lets you in on everything that he's really thinking about.
Yes, yeah. That's something that it wasn't until this exhibition that I understood with Colescott, that influence of the 30s and 40s, the popular culture from that time period. Definitely.
Well, Matthew, you've done a lot of work on the cartoons also.
Yeah, you don't see it so much in this painting. I spoke briefly to Carlos Villa. Carlos Villa was a very good friend of Colescott's. There are people here who knew him. He was a colleague of Colescott's at the San Francisco Art Institute. And about a number of years ago, I spoke to him on the phone, and he said Colescott really liked a cartoon strip called Right Around Home by Dudley Fisher. He didn't remember the exact name, but I figured that's what it was. And if you look at some of these paintings, not this one, but ones from a year or two later, he'll have the checkered floor and the kind of elevated perspective, and those are things that Dudley Fisher did. My own take is, Colescott had this experience in Egypt, which was a kind of an awakening of his own black identity. And when he returned to the Bay Area in 1970, it was like a revisiting of his youth and picking up where remembering his parents. His mother died in 1966. His father died in 1972. And he was remembering the comics, and through the visual language of the comics, dealing with some of this unfinished business from childhood. So it's almost Proustian. And Colescott read Proust in the original French. So there you go.
Yeah. And I think we have to remember that the 70s, all these kinds of childhood influences that he loved, 60s, 70s, the Westerns, the cartoons, the pinups, it was all part of the Artgeist at the time with pop art. Mm-hmm. So that, he had like this interlude in Egypt where he was kind of away from things, but moving in. And I think that you cannot although he associated with many of the prominent people on the West Coast scene that Matthews talked about, I say there is a relationship with R. Crumb that is scary.
Yes.
And I think that, the attitude towards women, even the way he drew women, the proportions of his women, we cannot underestimate the relationship with R. Crumb.
I agree with Lowery. I think, Colescott said once, one of the things I liked about California was you could do all kinds of weird things and people wouldn't think it's unusual because everyone was doing weird things. And absolutely, R. Crumb, the whole idea of letting it all hang out. Certainly, if you look at some of the drawings in the retrospective that are very sort of sexually explicit, certainly there's a connection.
Great. I want to talk about the wonderful section that you call Misbehaving Art History. This is one of my favorites. I really enjoy this, The Wreckage of the Medusa. And just as a reference, we've also brought in this slide so you can see the original influence. Do you want to talk about this a little bit?
Oh, I just think this one, the first time I saw it, I just fell out in hysterics. It just has so much. The Raft of the Medusa is about hope that you're going to be rescued. This is, in Bob's paintings, forget about it.
Right.
The ship's going down, the captain is sitting there, he didn't even go down with the ship. The more you look at it, so it has the HSS Medusa, the lady's legs coming out, the black guy swimming towards the Avon lady, there's Bob in the middle with a bottle, and all these legs coming. It's like a total, disaster and the ship going down. And it reminded me of when Bob had his 1987 retrospective. He had a concurrent show at Semaphore Gallery in New York, and Vivian Rayner was talking about his work. Now, I don't know if she was specifically talking about this painting, but she sort of said, Colescott knows that the ship of civilization is sinking, yet he remains on board. And I said, it's really a situation where the reviewer sees Colescott as not having much choice, as he is, quote, lashed to the mainmast by history, like everyone else, but as a black man more tightly. Besides, the reviewer notes, the painter believes that the ship's passengers may as well go down better informed than they floated, and to that end practices what he calls preacher's expressionism. So I think that, this is, I was just looking at it today and I said, oh my God, there's baby Moses in the, in the basket, floating. So it really is kind of like, how I feel now. We have locusts in the Sudan. We have storms. I couldn't get to Portland on Sunday because of the storms in the Midwest. You have fires. You have flooding. It's just, you kind of, and then we won't talk about the coronavirus. So I sit there and I go, I don't know if it is kind of a biblical moment, but it's certainly, when I look at this painting, that's how I feel.
Thank you for that. That's awesome. This one, I get a thrill too when I sees Deku. And so we brought up the two influences here, Willem de Kooning's Woman 1, and then Mel Ramos's version.
Right.
Here together.
I still get a thrill when I see Bill.
Yeah.
Well, this is the painting. This painting is why we have this show. Because Rafaela Plato, who is the director of the CAC, had seen Bob's work when she's from Germany, and she had seen it in the Venice Biennale in '97. And then she came and she worked at the Rose Museum at Brandeis, where this is. And this is the painting that always impressed her, and she says she always wanted to do a Colescott show, and that's how we came together to get this project going. I think, there are several paintings that deal with Aunt Jemima in the exhibition. And Aunt Jemima is such an interesting and complex, figure. we have to sort of remember that the character was created by a black woman named Nancy Green. And she was hired by a company that had this special flour that made pancakes. And they were sort of introducing pancakes into the American cuisine at the, I think, 1876 centennial or one of those things. But the thing of it is that when you look at the whole idea of a black woman with a kerchief on, it's something that has to do with Africa. Because if you go to West Africa, women wear geledes. When black women were brought over as slaves, wearing a hat and some kind of a scarf was an indication of status, whether you were free or whether you were a slave. So, it has such a kind of complex, situation. I always hearken to a photograph of the godmother in Cuba of Wilfredo Lam, who's another artist I spent a lot of time looking at. And her name was Montanica Wilson. And she's sitting there and she has on a plain spun dress. And she has a scarf around her neck. And by the way she is standing in relationship to the chair, this woman is over 6 feet tall. She must weigh 300 pounds, and she's got this teensy-weensy little handbag like Lizzo had the other day. And so you sit there and you look at that picture and you go, there is no way that woman is submissive, whatsoever. So we wanted to sort of have this kind of trio of, Aunt Jemima as a kind of avatar. I mean, what Bob would do is use stereotypes and put them into art historical masterpieces or art historical situations, which then elevated that motif and that icon and that image into a different space. And so we have another with Aunt Jemima and Colonel Saunders. I mean, they're separated, by at least 50 or 60 years. And then we have Aunt Jemima in sort of connubial bliss with Cactus Jack, the gold panhandler. So I think that, Bob really did sort of tackle the whole kind of situation of what Aunt Jemima was. Just bragging a little, when I published my article on Bob in 1984 in Art Forum magazine, whoever designed it had a previous article with the Koonings woman, and when you turned the page, there was Bob. So it was like making that point. So
nice.
It really was kind of a nice thing. Yeah. But I think also that paintings like this also remind us that sometimes we get so caught up in trying to decipher what Bob says, which is important. Mm-hmm. Most of the time I find I can't really precisely decipher what's going on in his crazy mind, but we try. Right. But it really emphasizes how he wanted to be seen largely as a painter. So the gesture, the sort of stroke, the sort of fulsomeness of the color, that's what Bob really wants us to look at in those paintings.
It's definitely such an attraction, immediate attraction, and then you see the naughty parts or the dangerous parts or all of it, but it lures you in first and foremost. I want to jump to this piece because it's connected to that discussion of stereotype. And if we can play the clip.
If I had one wish to make, this is the wish I would choose. I'd want an old straw hat, a suit of overalls, and a worn-out pair of shoes. Just let me roam around, laughing at big city blues, with an old straw hat, a suit of overalls, and a worn-out pair of shoes. Howdy, Mr. Brown, ho-hum, going fishing, hope you get a bite. Howdy, Mr. Jones, ho-hum, how's about a hayride Saturday night? Sing hi-ho, What have you got? What have you got to lose? Get an old straw hat, a suit of overalls, and a worn-out pair of shoes.
Trust Bob to take the fact
dear.
that Shirley Temple was married to Charles Black to create Shirley Temple Black, which was her name, and Bill Robinson White.
This is where, there's a lot of troubling things with Robert Colescott, but his use of stereotypes, in many ways, he pushes that envelope, but it also, I feel like, creates a problem. And they both hold space together. It all is together, and you have to negotiate it in one painting. And thinking about Aunt Jemima was a real person named Nancy Green. This is Bill Robinson, and he played into these characters. It's hard to negotiate that for me. I don't know if it's a question, but
Well, I think that what Bob is really doing in a painting like this is sort of questioning our assumptions about how people behave and how we associate certain attitudes towards certain kinds of people. So the question is something that Joe Lewis calls the what if factor. What if Shirley Temple was a little black girl? Then would America in the 1930s, or even America, well, today it might, would they have considered her America's sweetheart? At the same time, what do we think of a white man in the role of Bill Robinson having to be more accommodating, obsequious, and tapping, with a little black girl? So it's sort of like that kind of twist that we have to sort of like really think about in terms of what our secret desires of. And I saw some people laughing, at the Bill Bojangles. You see, you got caught up. Bob did it to you, honey. Because he sucks you in and you're laughing and then you're sitting there going, what exactly am I laughing at? And that's one of the things that, he really does all the time.
Right.
And Mitchell Kahan, we're really flogging this catalog. Bye.
It's gorgeous.
Mitchell Kahan, we reproduced an essay that he did for the exhibition that was curated by Mimi Roberts, who's here, and John Albrandt, who I hope is here tomorrow. Is John here? And I forgot what I was going to say. Senior moment.
Mimi Roberts.
Oh, right. Thank you, Mimi. So Mitchell Kahan has a great essay about his experience of laughing in front of a painting and turning around seeing this black woman who's looking at him like, what are you laughing at? So it's like how we negotiate humor, in many different kinds of situations.
Right. In reference to that African American experience, Du Bois coined that term double consciousness, and it seems like that internal conflict, the conflict of always looking at oneself through the eyes of a racist white society. It seems very much this is Colescott's entire biography. It's his paintings. It's everything. But he also is very problematic with women, the depiction of women in the paintings.
Stop. Really? Our Bob? Oh, come on. How could you say that?
But I think that his continual revisiting of this particular genre is really interesting. And Lowery, I was hoping you could kind of dissect this painting for us, because I love how you talk about it and all the nuances in this painting.
Well, this painting relates to a series that he did in the 80s called the Bather series. And it does have a kind of sequence in it, and we couldn't show all of them. There are some that are reproduced in the catalog. And there is a kind of sequence. The first painting seems to be this scene where a blonde white woman, only wearing a bra, washes up on shore, and she's rescued by these black and brown women. Now, the interesting thing is that she's wearing a bra, they're just wearing a cash sack, and they have bare breasts. So I can go into a whole thing about, the implications of civilization and primitivism according to what women, can wear, but I won't do that. But just remember, the missionaries, the first thing they did to Africa was cover up the ladies' breasts. Anyway, so through the series of paintings, the blonde white woman becomes one that's to be reckoned with. She sort of starts to mess with the sort of self-image, particularly of the women, in this, what is probably a rather closed society, as it would happen. And then what we sort of gradually see is the women regaining their self-confidence, and he introduces a white poet laureate who's appreciating the black form, and then so as soon they have their own sort of avatars as sort of like these kinds of black goddesses. Mm-hmm. So this one is a large painting that sort of sums up everything. It's based on the Judgment of Paris.
Mm-hmm. And I have it here.
There we are. This is the one that's in the Met, and I always was struck by the fact that Paris is sort of like laying back, he's got to choose the women, but, it seems to be an onerous kind of task. So if we go back to Bob's version, you see Bob's kind of laying there too. And the little golden apple he's supposed to get is kind of there. And then he always has a little witness, so there's a little young black, boy sort of watching, looking at the voyeur situation. And it's interesting that Bob has 4 goddesses rather than 3. And he has this multicultural group, of goddesses, sort of prancing around. I think that, in this sense, it's very interesting because we think of, in art history, particularly in the 80s and 90s, there was a lot of dialogue about the power of the gaze, the male gaze versus the female. And I think in many times, because Bob, sort of represents himself as kind of slightly overwhelmed and off to the side, that in a way he gives back a certain amount of power to the women because they're sort of showing themselves, like on their own terms. I don't know if this will be a kind of consciousness-raising group that will come out of this, sort of encounter here. Mm-hmm. But I think that it certainly, reflects his sort of first encounters, like in Egypt with so many different people. When I went to Egypt when I was in the same trip, we were taking going down the Nile to Aswan, and I guess I was the only African American in the group, and the purser, who was a darker Egyptian, came to me. He said, "You and me, Nubian," and I went, "Of course." And I'd be sitting on the boat having my Cleopatra moment, But it was interesting, like in this kind of sense, even in Egypt, there's all these different hues because there's so many cultures coming together. And Bob had an interesting quote where he talked about the fact that as you get, further south in Europe and further north in Africa, it all blends together, in a very interesting kind of way. So I think that this is a moment where Bob really sort of engages the gaze. And I don't know if you have a slide of Carrie Mae Weems.
I do.
You do?
And
okay.
I love that you talk about that idea of Colescott depicting himself as being overwhelmed.
Overwhelmed, yeah. So this, we have Mimi Roberts to blame for this because she was the commissioner for Colescott's show for the 97 biennial. And so she commissioned Carrie Mae Weems to do a portrait. You know, we have a portrait of the artist in the catalog. But Carrie Mae said, oh no, it's not going to be that simple. And so she wanted to engage a depiction of Bob, knowing his interest, and sort of bring them together with her interest. And she's always been interested in power, the gaze, in her photography. So this is one photograph in a triptych where she's sort of really talking about what is happening, you know, between her and Bob, and how they are really sort of, as she says, seduced by one another, yet bound by certain social conventions and also by modernism, so that their relationship can't be a clear one-on-one. It is sort of determined by so many different things, of her being a woman artist, him being a male artist, she being a nude model, he being a not, you know, like he being the sort of male artist. And it's interesting that she keeps herself in the back and the corner, you know, like of his studio, but she's really pulling the strings in the whole thing.
I love that this is in the exhibition, because for me, it really frames that very dilemma of the figures in many of Colescott's paintings. It is problematic, but here is Carrie Mae Weems, and as she says, they're both framed by modernism. I think what I love about the triptych too is Carrie's gaze never escapes the frame.
Right.
It stays within it. So you see that sense of entrapment, and yet she is the author of this photograph.
Well, it strikes me a lot after like about 1980, you know, you have all these, in the 70s, you have all these singular poster girls who like look right out at you. And after the 80s, the figures don't engage you that much. You know, like there's a rare kind of situation. They are really, male and female, very much subsumed into their own dramas. Mm-hmm. And then you are pulled in by trying to sort of figure out, I mean, they almost demand that you ask to be let into the paintings, you know, so that you have to make that choice to do that rather than sort of, you know, having to sort of confront that direct stare. It sort of struck me when I started looking again. I said, oh, yeah, everybody's sort of like really into their, you know, own sort of thing in a way.
Yeah. I want to just touch on this because it's the latest painting in the exhibition, and I'm so pleased that it's included in this exhibition. To me, it tells us a lot about how he worked, his process, and the visual language that continues to come back even in the latest part of his life.
Mm-hmm. I think that the great thing about this is that Alfredo Carreras and a couple of his students talk about the fact that Bob prepared a painting, and you can sort of look at it, where you see magenta. He used magenta as a ground rather than a white gesso that you would expect. So it's like he's almost building up from this kind of rich, pulsating color to sort of create his figures. I guess by this time, you know, Bob was beginning to sort of show symptoms of Parkinsonian syndrome, but he kept painting, you know, and so, you know, it sort of really accommodates to a situation, but it doesn't look inept in any way. Mm-hmm. It just looks like, you know, he's arrived at a certain point, he's done the figures, and now he's sort of like breaking them back down in a way that maybe he did in the 50s, you know, sort of, you know, emphasizing the stroke and sort of like the colors. But there's always something very provocative. Now, you know, like he gives a title and now you go and hunt, you know, to sort of see what's happening. But I think these paintings are, such beautiful abstractions with just enough figural references to sort of like, add a little tension to them and sort of really create a beautiful kind of coda to his career.
Right. I've come to really appreciate Robert Colescott with this exhibition. And I think I've also have this greater sense of empathy. And when we were talking yesterday, you asked me how I felt about the show. And I think I said something like I was delighted, I was kind of joyful. And it doesn't sound like the right words to use, because it's so complicated. But I think what I appreciate so much is that he put it all out there for us in perpetuity. So I wanted to end on this slide. It's one of my favorite quotes by Colescott. "If you decide to laugh, don't forget the humor is the bait. And once you've bitten, you may have to do some serious chewing. The tears may come later." And I think about one of the things, this idea of racial melancholia really struck with me. It's last year, this critic, David Eng, and psychotherapist Shinhee Han wrote a book about the Asian American experience, critically thinking about Freud's privileged theory of unresolved grief and melancholia. The writers proposed that this concept of melancholia that I've personally been drawn to as it looks to depathologize the structure of that everyday experience. The writers pull from literature, which I thought was really fantastic, and one of the references is Danzy Senna's 1998 novel, Caucasia. And I'll read the excerpt from that book that they write about. Configuring whiteness as a contagion, Birdie Lee, the narrator of Danzy Senna's Caucasia, connects assimilation to illness and disease. Separated from her African-American activist father, Birdie and her blue-blooded mother flee from the law in a racialized and radicalized 1970s Boston. Eventually, the two take up residence in New Hampshire, where Birdie passes as Jessie and for white. This assimilation into the whiteness of New Hampshire plagues Birdie, who wonders, if I had actually become Jessie, and it was this girl, this Birdie Lee, who haunted these streets, searching for ghosts, who was the lie. This vexing condition of whiteness not only alters the narrator's physical world, the manner in which Birdie walks, talks, dresses, and dances. Moreover, it configures the sphere of the affective, the ways in which Birdie ultimately apprehends the world and its occupants around her. Physically and psychically haunted, Birdie Jessie feels contaminated. This is the condition of racial melancholia. This idea of being contaminated and the haunting presence, I wonder how that relates. I mean, I see it in all of Colescott's paintings that we have here. But I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit.
It's kind of interesting because I think it really depends on one's upbringing and sort of parental influences. My parents both were from Southern families. My father is more so than my mother. My father came to New York, came up north after World War II because he realized as a black man he would never have anything, and he became an architect, and my mother was a medical technician at Mount Sinai. I suspect the first black person to do that. And then she became a stay-at-home mother and then went back and became a librarian. We were raised in a racially mixed neighborhood, but we were always, we had lots of conversations about race. We had lots of conversations about intra-racial color differences, My mother was using the term black long before it was fashionable. And there's always a story my mother's going on about how we're black. And my younger sister goes, black, she says, I have eyes, I can see, I'm brown. And so, my brother and I looked at my mother like, okay, so how are you going to handle that, Mom? And so Mom says, okay, everybody in the family's black except Benna, who's brown. So the thing of it is that in an odd way, because we talked about it so much, there was never any kind of melancholy on that level. Mm. I think the melancholy came for us later because our parents told us we could do whatever we wanted. But then when you go out into the world, the world tries to tell you, you can't. So there's a couple of ways you do that. You become melancholic and, sort of do that kind of pathology. I was lucky to fall in with a group of eustreperious bad girls. And we just figured anytime somebody said no, we'd find a way around it, and we got exactly what we wanted anytime we wanted, even if we had to wait. So I think that I think what I think about melancholy in myself personally, I think about the fact that we still have so far to go. And maybe that's not melancholy, maybe it's frustration and anger. Mm-hmm. But on the whole, I think as you move around the world, I'm so interested, particularly in this country, as you travel, that a lot of the stuff that I see on TV, I don't meet that. I meet people who are, they don't have to love me, but they sort of respect me. We have a successful transaction, no matter what race we are, and we sort of move on. And I think that, that's really kind of like the melancholy of this country at this point. Mm-hmm. How do we sort of really do that in a meaningful way?
Right. In thinking about Colescott, you could do whatever you want. And I think that idea of, not getting tenured at Berkeley and moving to Tucson, right? That experience, I wonder. And then his early years to not address his race and how then that gets kind of played out in his paintings. I wonder.
Yeah, but his paintings are not what I would call melancholic.
Right.
I think his paintings are sort of smart-ass in a way, because once he got it and he sort of realized the untenable situation that he was in, he was just going to really sort of push the envelope,
right?
To get people to deal with certain kinds of issues,
right? And it wasn't this sort of longing, this kind of yearning.
I don't know. There are others in the room who can speak to that better than me.
Great. Matthew, do you want to add any last remarks? Well, I think we've reached the end of our conversation. If we want to take any questions, thank you, Lowery. Thank you, Matthew.
I perceive kind of a communion among Mr. Colescott, R.B. Smith, and Kehinde Wiley. Do you have any comment?
I think Kehinde Wiley is one of the young artists, along with Kara Walker, Jeffrey Hargrove, Beverly McIver, who've taken a lot of clues from it. It was interesting. Jason Farago wrote an interesting article in the New York Times, because at this moment the Brooklyn Museum is showing Kehinde Wiley's adaptation of Napoleon, by David. And he raised some interesting questions, of whether or not, this kind of appropriation that is very close. I mean, Kehinde is a little closer than Bob. Bob would have, had some hot dogs or something on it, But he raised the question of whether or not that was a way of helping, say, a younger black person, feel more, attached to the situation rather than doing something, slightly different. And Kehinde is an artist that I was very close to when I was the director of the Studio Museum. He used to come down constantly and drag me up to the studio. I kept going, I'm a director, I gotta raise money, I can't sit here and talk to you, Kehinde. But, he has a very specific, agenda that he fulfills. And I think, in a way, what he does is the same thing with Bob, is he sort of takes a personage or a character that would not ordinarily be seen as fine art or in haute couture or something, and places them in that kind of context. So I think for that reason, I think his work is very effective. But if I had to sort of say my druthers, I like his original portraits, like the one he did of President Obama.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I have another question over here.
Thank you. This is really fascinating. I find the selection of Egypt, his choice of going to Egypt, so interesting in so many different ways. You made reference to the different hues and colors of people in Egypt, and how it's sort of north meeting south or south meeting north. But the thing that I find even more interesting, and I have never seen Colescott's work before, and it's brilliant, is that Egypt is always personified as being the source of Judeo-Christian society, cultures and legacies in Rome and everything. But in point of fact, Egypt is African, not only in its geographic space, and not only in terms of the physiology of many of the pharaohs, but it's placed centrally in African history. And so what it does is, like Bob's work, turns the world upside down, or plays with the world, because rather than Africa, this part of Africa being this primitive, backwards place, it's the source of Judeo-Christian civilization. So I think that is just, I don't know if that was intentional, how he got there, but I think it's just amazingly important.
No, I think that's true. I mean, I grew up in, fighting to sort of have Egypt be part of Africa. And it was because they built pyramids and, they couldn't be, associated with sub-Saharan African, because they didn't do things like that. They built houses out of twigs and mud. But I always used to tell people, I said, Jansen, the history of art, the palette of Narmar, Narmar came from the south. Upper Egypt was the south, and he united Egypt going to Lower Egypt, which is up north. So that meant that Narmar probably came from the area we now know as the Sudan. And people just sit there and go, oh, okay, yeah. But it was, it's right there, the palette of Narmar in Jansen's History of Art. But you make a very good point. Thanks.
Well, I have another question over here in the front.
I first discovered Robert Colescott's work in Ken Johnson's article in Art in America. And what first impressed me was the storm of outrageous color combinations and the storm of brushstrokes. And I think some of the early writers at the time of Ken Johnson used the word strident color combinations and vibrant brushstrokes. And I'm wondering, I took that to mean the visual equivalent of jazz music. And from what you said, Dr. Sims, about his wanting the public to see his painterliness, I'm wondering if he overtly and consciously knew that he was creating a visual equivalent of jazz music. It works for me, but I'm curious to know whether it was something that was conscious for him.
Yeah. He liked jazz, didn't he? Did he say he worked? Yeah, he worked with music. I mean, he did drums and things like that. I mean, I sort of resist, putting jazz on too much of contemporary art, because everybody does. It's the easy way to sort of make a combination. But I think, given his father was a musician, and that he was, very interested in music, and his grandson, where are you? He just left. We'll hear his grandson tomorrow at the opening. So I think that, the music analogy makes sense.
And I have another question back here.
First of all, thank you very much for your presentations. I have been educated a good bit tonight. I'm wondering, this show started in Cincinnati, is that right? I'm curious to know what Cincinnati has to do with Robert. What's the association? We know the association in Portland. What's the association in Cincinnati?
None. No, the association is that the director has been a longtime fan, and she was the one who approached me about doing the show, and then I brought Matthew on board because we had been doing some work together. But he didn't have any Cincinnati roots. But we're very happy to have it in Portland.
Thank you.
Well, mostly I just want to say thank you for putting this presentation together and the entire exhibit. As a mother of a child who has biracial grandparents, and one of them being Robert Colescott, it's been really interesting being in this decade, dealing with the racial conversations and having this as a gift to give my son and other children of biracial backgrounds to be able to, start the inquiry into what that means is so profound. And I'm sorry that Colescott had to leave. He has a gig tonight, but you'll see him more tomorrow. But it's really been a profound impact on his life to be part of that inquiry and to know that his grandfather was such a pioneer in raising awareness to that conversation.
That's awesome. Where's Colescott's gig tonight?
Oh, he's at Clyde's Steakhouse.
Okay.
Go to
That's
Clyde's.
where we go next. Thank you for that.
I keep thinking about Philip Guston and painting and who wasn't part of the canon and how they sort of reacted against it. And I wonder if there's any conversation around that in relation to Robert Colescott's work.
Yeah, that's a great one.
That's a good one.
Yeah.
Yeah, he did talk about Guston. There was, when he went to talk to Leger talked about how he gave up abstraction, and Guston went through the same experience. There was an interview with Colescott in Colorado in 1993, and he talked about Guston, that Guston was an artist that he admired. He talked about, Guston had been a sort of socially conscious figural painter in the 30s. And then he became an abstract expressionist, and then in the late 60s he kind of switched back and he incorporated some of that earlier imagery. In the 30s he included images of Klansmen, and so Colescott admired that. He thought that he talked about Guston as a painter he admired. He thought he was a tough artist, and he admired him, and he did talk about him. So absolutely.
Great. Well, it's 7:30. Should we allow some time to head upstairs and take a sneak peek? Thank you.